Okay, so what we wanted, Yassen and I wanted to talk through is just some intellectual frameworks and ideas around how you can go about analysing global health policy making, and how you can think about stuff. And we're going to talk particularly about the recent COVID resolution that was adopted at the World Health Assembly, and how you can think about interpreting how that decision was made and what was in it, and looking at why particular decisions and why certain things were in it and why certain things were perhaps left out and not referenced to. So the objectives of this session, basically a quick overview, which may be fairly basic to most of you, where and how is global health policy decided, and thinking through what the venues are for global health policy making, and how are those decisions come to, who are the key actors involved in making these decisions, and what are their interests, and we're going to particularly focus on the role of the WHO, both as an actor in and of its own right, but also as a venue for decision making. And then finally, we're going to talk through some theoretical frameworks drawing from the realms of political science and international relations theory for thinking about how you can go about looking at a global health decision and going, why was this particular decision taken? Does this make sense? What can potentially explain this? And then obviously you can build out from that on, well, if this explains it, this theoretical construct, then what should I logically, building upon that, be doing about it if I want to influence policy? So starting off, to think where global health decision making is, it really can be quite a range of places. So you can think of the individual patient, and the decisions that they make are shaping global health policy. People's behaviors shape the dynamics of infections, as we can see with COVID, whether people going in and out. So that at an individual level, individual behaviors and decisions are kind of key in shaping global health decision making. We could think through decision making at the level of a local health facility. What resources do they have available to them? How are they interacting with their patients? How do they allocate the resources they have available to them to particular services? Why do they prioritize one service over another service? And we can think of this applying to health facilities in high-income countries as well as low and middle-income countries. So thinking about decisions in this space, again, at that level. We could go up another level to kind of think through specifically a Ministry of Health, and at the Ministry of Health level, how are decisions made? What is shaping them? Are they being shaped by local health facilities? Are they being shaped by the prerogatives of yet another level up of national government? And then we can think again, kind of taking another step removed, looking at regional bodies such as the European Union or the African Union, or even supranational bodies such as the WHO, and think about where decision making is being made. And you can apply this on where's the decision that is affecting the level that is one level smaller being made, and how that is working. But you can also think about it as, when you're critically approaching a global health policy issue, is this actually the right level to be making a decision on this thing? So we were talking about digital health earlier. At what level is the right level for policy making on a digital health issue? Is it at the local healthcare facility level, deciding how they're going to implement a digital healthcare infrastructure? Or is it something that's much more appropriate to be at the global level, such as potentially standards and ethics and sort of those kind of things? And then what level of detail is appropriate at each level? And what level of decision making produces the best outcome in policy making? And depending on the issue and the topic, I think that varies. And depending on how you think different actors are behaving and responding to making a decision, then you may argue that policy making should be perhaps one level up. So, for example, the mayor of a major city in a country that I lived in made particularly homophobic remarks and policy decisions around LGBT individuals. And they were initially supported by the national government, but then regional bodies came out with statements and kind of drawed regional bodies and supranational bodies and other governments to put pressure on them to go, actually, that policy at a much more smaller level is particularly harmful, and perhaps a more global universal policy lens is appropriate to that relatively smaller setting. And this is where, again, you need to kind of start thinking of where is the decision being made, who is making it, and at what level should it be made? And there isn't a right answer to this question on how best to make policy making, and should it be? And we kind of, I guess, are moving in a direction of both, or we have historically, perhaps less now in an era of nationalism, towards decision-making both being very decentralized. So at the level of urban governments, one of the biggest policymakers on health policy in the US is the New York City government. That is below a state level, but meanwhile, you're also having decision-making being taken over by global bodies such as the European Union, playing a much more strong role in health policy making in particularly European countries. Unfortunately, the UK is no longer part of the EU. The next lens you can apply to this is looking at different actors and their particular interests. And I guess this is a conceptual framework for thinking about how you would group different actors in global health policy making. So the prime actor, and I guess this is the actor that most people think about when they think about governing and decision making, is the idea of the nation state. This is a kind of a relatively, in terms of human history, relatively recent concept, but has been kind of the underpinning of governance and policy making really since the past couple of 100 years, where we think about individual nation states as individual actors able to make decisions. And also that they can perhaps form groupings of like-minded states. So within the context of the WHO, you have a grouping known as the G77 and China, which is a grouping of countries that were not part of the West and high-income countries during the Cold War, and are a group of like-minded developing countries making decisions. You can also think about intergovernmental organizations, both as actors in their own right. And you can think about universal membership intergovernmental organizations like the WHO, where every member, unless barring Taiwan, and discussion and views on Taiwan's ability to join, but basically everyone can join as a member. Or you can have organizations that are much more limited in their membership. So you can have things like the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which does make decisions and does make policy. And there are other organizations that have more limited membership, but are still policy-making, decision-making organizations, and are actors and are governed by member states. And then finally, you can think about civil society organizations. So non-governmental organizations, and we can kind of group those up of, these are not state actors, and we can, I guess, think about them in two kind of separate ways. We can either think about public interest NGOs, so this would be your Oxfams, your Médecins Sans Frontières, your other International Committee of the Red Cross organizations that are not for profit and not representing business interests. And you can think of your business interest minded organizations. So this might be the US Chamber of Commerce or the International Chamber of Commerce, or actually even individual corporations. And there is some blurring between all of these organizations in terms of how they interact and behave. And sometimes nation states can act on behalf of corporations or individual actors. But this is what you need to start thinking about, of at what kind of actor is making the decision and what is their roles and responsibilities. Civil society organizations are not directly accountable to their citizenry in the same way as a nation state, and intergovernmental organizations are primarily accountable to nation states and governments. Another way of thinking about this is to think about, specifically when we're thinking about intergovernmental organizations as global health actors and their role in global health policy making, is to think about a continuum. So who can be a member of their organization, and is it an organization that is purely a venue, so it only is a platform for people to sit and discuss things, or is it a venue that can actually do something? So let's take the example of the G20. The G20 is purely a decision-making space. The G20 doesn't have a large secretariat. It does not have a body that does something. The G20 is purely a platform for the 20 largest economies in the world to sit and talk about issues that matter. On the other hand, there are other organizations such as this slide is a little outdated because I've poached it, that is now the G7, and that you can tell this is how long ago I made this slide. The venues that can do something. So the G7 does actually have programs under it. There is a Health 7 where they do have technical cooperation programs. There's a patient safety forum of health ministers under the auspices of the G7. So again, it is primarily a venue for people to discuss things, but it can do stuff. And then the third category, which is a lot clearer, is a venue for decision-making, of which the WHO is one. But the WHO is not only a venue for decision-making, the WHO actually does things. The WHO sets norms and standards. The WHO is responsible for coordinating humanitarian and health response to health emergencies in many countries. So the WHO both does something, but is also a place where other people decide what WHO should do. So it's kind of got this hybrid role. It is not purely a venue and a space for global health policy making. It is a actor in and of its own right and has its own particular set of interests, of which there are interests that are purely belonging to WHO. And we can then think about the organizational membership of them. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but you can basically have an international organization that's a venue for discussion that's purely civil society, like the World Economic Forum, that the Great and the Good gather in Davos every year to talk about issues, and the WEF also produces lots of reports on lots of issues such as obesity. You can have platforms that are governments with civil society engagement, the WHO is one, and you can have platforms that actually there isn't any mechanism for civil society or non-governments and non-member states to engage with, and the traditional ones are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Actually, there is no role formally, although this has changed a little bit, for civil society to be directly involved in their governing and decision-making, and that the venue is not actually for civil society to talk with governments at the World Bank meetings or the IMF meetings. Another way of thinking about global health policy making, and again, this probably applies more to low and middle income countries, and is more, I guess, the traditional lens of looking at global health, is you can think about the donor and recipient. So when we think of global health, often we do think about HIV programs, PEPFAR, people giving out ARVs in a low-income country. Obviously, those of us who are more interested and perhaps enlightened do view global health as significantly broader, and it's relevant to both high, low, and middle-income countries. But this traditional model of global health policy making, so you have a donor government, perhaps such as my own. I used to work for a donor. I used to work for the UK government and work in DFID. And as a government, as a donor, you would provide overseas development assistance to a country. And with that would come strings attached, and that assistance could either be to an organization to do something on behalf of that country, such as we would pay Save the Children to deliver a nutrition program or write nutrition guidelines, or it can be in the form of direct budget support, which is the more traditional model, where the UK government would give money to directly into the budget of the Ministry of Health in Rwanda. And the recipient of this financial aid would then have a contract or an understanding with the donor government where they would have to report on what they were doing with that money. And in turn, they would have that money to spend on whatever the money was allocated for. And the Ministry of Health ability to make decisions on global health policy priorities would be constrained by how much freedom the donor would give them. And even if the donors did say they wanted to empower them, ultimately that Ministry of Health decision-making is still entirely dependent, and their funding, on donors. And in fact, in many ministries of health in low-income countries, their decision-making is entirely constrained by what the donors want. And there are interesting governments such as Rwanda that have been able to push back against donors and go, actually, I know you said you wanted to give us money for X, but we can actually think we can spend it better. And the classic example is Agnes Binagwaho, who was an amazing Minister of Health in Rwanda, who pushed Gavi to allow her to, many years before this became the norm, roll out the human papillomavirus vaccine, and going like, actually, I know that you don't see this as a development priority, but I see this as an important global health, local health priority, and I'm going to push to demand that that should be rolled out here. We also have the, and obviously the donors got pushed back a bit on that, and they agreed to allow Rwanda to be funded to roll out HPV and give money to that as part of their vaccine programs. And then obviously the recipient is directly accountable to the beneficiary, so be it the NGO or be it the Ministry of Health, is essentially responsible for delivering services to someone who receives the ultimate end product, be that a vaccine, be that drugs, be that a healthcare service. And this is somewhat distorting because you essentially have a system where ministries of health are directly accountable to their citizenry and to individuals, but meanwhile you have the Ministry of Health is also accountable to another master. They are accountable to the donor, who is not has no accountability to an individual citizen. So a donor is not accountable. Then no one is going to kick Boris Johnson out of office because of a healthcare program that that the UK government is financing that has gone wrong in another low-income country. So this is the traditional model of aid and some of the problems that are associated with it. I'm now going to hand over to Yassen, who's going to talk a bit about specifically development assistance for health and financing of global health, and how power and decision making, particularly around allocation of resources, is made.
Thanks, Mike. So I think this feeds the thinking about how the money flows are happening in global health is interesting when trying to bridge that decision making function of global health organizations or in global health and the doing part of what's going on. So I have a few slides. I'm going to be relatively brief on them, but we'll kind of look at where the money goes as basically a proxy of what's going on. So this first one is basically trying to illustrate how money for global health has changed over the last few years. Over the last 30 or so years, you see that it's close to a 400% increase in how money is given. And I think interesting of note as of, Mike, you're trying to erase the little line, interesting of note of what's been going on recently is the importance of the US in this whole story, both at the beginning of in the 90s, but also today. They've pretty much, we'll see in the next slide, conserved the proportion of how much they give. So of note here, the bottom one, the blue, and how the green also has changed. Here, similar concept. The first on the left-hand side, you see the development assistance proportionally from each source. So you see at the bottom, the US basically has represented over the last 30 years anywhere between 20 and 30% of global health development assistance funds to the world, which is a concern when we see recent things such as the US threatening to withdraw funding from the WHO. We'll come to it in future slides, that the US is funding global health through a number of mechanisms. The WHO is just one of those. So it's not as if the US, this is going to go to zero, but it still is a significant funder in many ways of the WHO as well. I think another important element to look at here is how, basically looking at the green section here, how private entities, so foundations and corporations, have changed over time. If we look from the 90s to 2019, roughly their proportional segment of global health funding has doubled. And this means that in actual terms, it has increased many hundreds of percents, given what we saw previously. On the right-hand side of this slide, you're seeing the channels through which the funding is passing. So it's not who's giving it, but where the money is going before eventually reaching the target population. I've put this one up in order to look specifically at WHO, which is the dark yellow, and where you, where you see how it's basically decreased in importance. That's not to say that the WHO funding has decreased, because it has not. It has increased over the last few years, like everything in global health, but proportionally, the role of the organization with respect to the changing the changing international dynamics, and the changing international context that has many other actors has shrunken. If we could say has shrunken in the last few years, with NGOs having taken a lot larger proportion of what's available in terms of money. We can change slides. Maybe I'll skip this one and I'll come back to it after the next one. So I think that looking at the money, we get kind of one picture where the money is probably the closest proxy of the doing function of international organizations. Money comes in, you use it to deliver a program. We could have looked at, you can also look at what specific programs are delivered with that money. And then the other side of this question is who's making the decisions of what we should be doing. Here I'm taking the example of WHO. Basically, the WHO has a couple of structures that are guiding its work. There's the governing body, so the World Health Assembly. Some of you may have attended the online version of it. There's the executive board, also a decision-making body of a smaller group of members. There's a secretariat, regional offices, country offices. So those are the structures that support an organization to take decisions and do its work. Then there's different places within those structures. There's plenaries, there's committees, drafting groups, informal meetings, and obviously even more informal than informal meetings, anything that people bumping into each other. And I think that it's important to consider the fact that the formal structures are not necessarily the places where most of the decisions are taken. Usually, and you'll have seen it if you watch the World Health Assembly, not much of what happened at the World Health Assembly was actual debate. It was more countries coming forward and describing their own context, describing their own realities, and then sitting back down. Those statements could have been prepared 3 weeks in advance and didn't necessarily talk to each other. Obviously, we also did see a couple of countries talking to each other, kind of parallel to the main agenda, when we were, for instance, when they were responding to each other at the end of the scheduled sessions. So we do see a bit of that, but a lot of that usually happens in those more informal spaces. And that's where the crux of each individual thing that is being discussed gets figured out. It's in those things that are more closed. So drafting groups usually, which are not open to civil society, at least in the WHO. In other organizations, they sometimes are. Informal meetings, which are not, and hallway discussions, which basically happen between whoever's in the hallway at that point in time. Those different decision structures there are rules attached around the formal decision structures. And like I'm saying, that the informal ones, they don't necessarily have rules. They're self-governed spaces. If someone meets someone over coffee, well, there's no rules around how that happens. Just go back one slide. So basically, if we look here at how basically going back to the funding part of this, I find it interesting to look at how things go towards, how funds flow towards WHO, as we've taken that one as an example. WHO falls into this purple category in the middle, NGOs and foundations. And if you follow the line that goes from the US, you see that the US basically has a similar proportion in the UN system as it does in general in global health. Somewhere in the area of the 20 to 30% of the funds come from the US. And you also see how important the philanthropies are in funding UN programs. Basically, the philanthropies are probably occupying a space that's similar as the largest country funder. All the other governments is a lot smaller than all the philanthropies together. You can move on to the 2 slides from now. Yeah. Here we've zoomed in basically at that purple section to see what's going on with the different organizations that deliver global health are. The WHO and UNICEF being the 2 big ones, and then a couple of other UN agencies around them. Again, interestingly here, I'm putting those slides to point out what things could be, how things could be changing. We see the US being a very important stream in here, and we see the philanthropies being an important stream as well. Next slide. And finally, here's the detail of the WHO. Basically, any funding decision that happens from the US to a UN organization means that that organization has to amputate a significant portion of what it's doing. And that's currently what's on the back side of everyone's mind in the organization, I am sure. It's also important to see here the Gates Foundation, for example, a single organization that probably has the control over 10% of WHO activities. If you change slides. Okay. This all brings us to how WHO is funded. Member states assessed contribution, so that's the second item on the left, is what each country has to give as a membership fee, if you want, to WHO. That's now only 15% of the WHO budget, and that percentage used to be a lot higher in the past. It's over time it has shrunken. This means that WHO is vulnerable to the whims of countries deciding to fund specific programs, in a way. Countries and other actors deciding to fund specific programs. So member states voluntary specified is exactly that. It's a country deciding that I have in my own national priority, national interest, I have the desire to fund programs for women and children. So I will give a specific envelope to the World Health Organization for that purpose, which is good when the decision-making bodies of the WHO have decided that it's a priority and they wish to work for it, and there's now money to do it. However, it can create distortions into what the WHO does and what the decision-making part of the WHO would like the organization to do. So despite the countries coming in together in a system that's in theory, one country, one vote, in practice, regardless of those decisions, what happens on the ground is very much dictated by the amount of resources available for that to happen. We can change slides. I think it's over. Yeah. So basically, I think that this section I wanted to highlight this tension between decision-making powers and financial flows influencing those decisions. And the WHO is a single example. This happens in most settings. Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Yassen. And I think that's really important when bearing in mind and thinking about WHO decision-making, is that some bits of WHO are funded and others are not. That's why certain policy areas, and I'm trying to think things like global surgery or anesthesia, there may be 1 or 2 people in the whole of the World Health Organization, an organization with thousands of staff, that it is their job to deal with that, everything to do with that particular thematic agenda item. So again, if issues are not funded and not prioritized by member states, then they are not done that. The flip side is, of course, that some of these voluntary contributions are increasingly, WHO is getting unrestricted voluntary contributions from countries, particularly Germany and the UK to a certain extent. But what they expect instead is particular standards of accounting and ensuring that the money is spent well and effectively. And having, as in a previous role, been involved in a multilateral aid review and looking at UK government assistance to a number of multilateral organisations, of which WHO was one of them, it is very hard to sometimes go, has this money delivered value for money, bearing in mind it is ultimately, at the end of the day, even if it does come from a high-income country, and that does give them unbridled power, the money is paid for out of mine and other citizens' taxpayers' money, and therefore there has to be an accountability for ensuring that that money is spent well and ensuring that it is spent fairly, because it is taxpayers' money. But at the same time, how do you minimize that distorting what WHO does, given that that WHO is accountable to all member states, and it is in theory one member, one vote. So therefore, it should be just as accountable to the people of Nauru as it is to the people of the United States of America. So that's a really kind of important framework to, when we're again thinking about global health decision making, how our resources are allocated. I'm going to go through another way of thinking about this global health decision making, and this it's going to be quite superficial. I'm only going to go through in very kind of a low-level way some ideas from international relations theory and a bit from political science, and looking at sort of political science, to kind of think about how can we go about approaching and understanding how global health decisions are made and how policy is made. What frameworks can we use to try and build a model to understand decision making? And if we can understand why decisions are made, then we can perhaps understand how we can influence them. And a lot of these slides are based on a really interesting paper. It's not perfect, but I think it was one of the few papers that I found that actually tries to tackle this, of can you align global health policy with international relations theory, because international relations theory has this huge body of literature, but it's predominantly associated with war and peace, but it's looking at how governments interact and how they behave on the global stage. So I'm going to go through some potential frameworks from this. So first of all, you've got what is the classical theory of international relations. And this is a theory that has been around for a long time. It takes a very dark view of how governments and how states behave and how they should interact. So it's a Hobbesian view. Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher from the 1600s. The state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Governments are in it for themselves, and that they are purely self-interested, and all decisions taken should be based upon this understanding that actually everyone is ultimately making decisions in their own best interest, not in a global collective interest, and that you should be making your decisions around that framework. It has some assumptions that underpin this framework. So the world is chaotic, it is disorderly, it is anarchical, it relies on self-help. So governments are ultimately only really need to help themselves. They're not responsible for helping others. And anything they do for others should be based on what is in it for me. As I said, they're acting out of self-interest. They shouldn't be dependent on others. So what does this look like in practice? States take decisions based on rational self-interest. Whatever global health architecture there is out there, it is to be used when it is self-serving. And power ultimately is what matters in decision-making. And the most powerful entity in decision-making and policy-making is the state, the government. And this, perhaps you can think about it in terms of governments, particularly Donald Trump, I think, is an example of applying an entirely realist framework to global health policy making. Of he's going, make America great again, America first, and therefore all decision making has to be taken with that lens of America is getting screwed by the rest of the world, therefore I have to act in my own self-interest. And it is a framework to look at things, because it is when you apply a realist framework to decision making, it does make you question that assumption of what is the selfish motive underpinning a policy decision. And how would you act if you were trying to behave in the best interest of your particular member state or its interest? A classic example of this would be when China, during the H1N1 swine flu pandemic, locked up everyone of Mexican origin in China, because it was acting purely out of self-interest. It was not acting, even though WHO and Mexico said, please don't do this, China went, now it's in our interest, we're just going to do this anyway, and we don't really care what the rest of you do. And ultimately, there's nothing you can do to stop us either, because we are a powerful government. Whereas if a tiny little country that was like Guatemala had gone, actually, we want to kick all the Mexicans out, that would not work because Guatemala is relatively small and has less power relative to Mexico, so Guatemala can't make the same decision, hypothetically, if Guatemala had wanted to do that. So that's kind of a way of looking at things, but it is limited. It does overemphasize the role of government. It does not recognize the role and value of institutions such as the WHO or non-state actors such as NGOs. And it assumes that governments are not capable of making decisions that are not purely in their own self-interest and that only that framework. And it is quite a useful framework for thinking about resource competition and things like that. And actually, when looking at COVID, perhaps quite a useful framework for understanding how some governments have behaved around PPE. Another framework, a liberal institutionalist framework. Some people call it a neoliberal framework, but neoliberalism also has other connotations, so I'm going to focus more on the institutionalist bit of it. And the classical kind of arguers of this, who would be the sort of in the end of the Cold War era and perhaps a bit before that, kind of thinking around the role of institutions in decision making. Robin Cook, who was a British Foreign Secretary and Foreign Minister, who unfortunately died in the early 2000s and tried to build a ethical, or what he defined as an ethical foreign policy, said, we live in a modern world in which nation states are interdependent. In that modern world, foreign policy is not divorced from domestic policy, but a central part of any political program. There are some assumptions that underpin this model. So there's a rejection of purely power politics as the only outcome of international relations or policy making. States are still the key actor, governments are key, but can and will, with the right institutions such as WHO, create frameworks for mutual gain and be able to cooperate. And creating and maintaining strong global institutions is the best method to facilitate ties between nations and states to advance their own long-term interests. What does this look like in practice? It's our traditional world rules-based global order that's based on the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So it's a framework of going, these institutions are what matter and they underpin decision-making. And that states behave rationally and it is in their own interest to cooperate, and competition should take place only within these frameworks. But it is limited. It's still very state-centric. It's still focused primarily on governments. Institutions are only as useful as members allow them to be. And as we were talking about WHO financing, WHO as a place to make decisions is dependent on the strength of the institution, and that is in turn dependent on the strength of member states. And who defines what is the common interest? It's all very well and good saying that states are going to interact and behave in a way that is in their common interest, but actually, what does this mean in practice? It usually still skews towards the interest of the most powerful states. And we can look at free trade agreements and open markets as examples of this, and how decisions are taken in organizations such as the World Trade Organization, and how that really shapes and affects things. So that model has its limitations. The next model is a little more kind of abstract, and it's, I guess, a bit more of a critical model. It's a constructivist framework, and there's lots written on this, and I do not pretend to be an expert on a constructivist approach to international relations. But it kind of takes a bit of a pragmatic approach. It does take stuff from liberal institutionalism and realism. But it also says that actually you can't understand the behavior of global health actors or global actors without understanding context, namely what ideas shape them, their interests, their identities, and how that actor sees themselves and how they see others. States will shape their behavior to comply with social norms that evolve over time. So states will, for example, implement lockdowns and implement those kind of things in a COVID response based on what they see other people doing and how they perceive themselves as a government. And for example, a government may fail to share information, but then feel a bit embarrassed and share it, as with China and COVID, and try and explain it away, showing that they understand that there is a norm and an expected behavior. And the framing of policy issues is perhaps more important than necessarily their kind of actual impact. And the example of this I will give is that HIV gets a disproportionate amount of global health funding relative to something such as non-communicable diseases. And this is probably due to the framing and how governments see the issue of HIV and how citizens see the issue of HIV versus how they see obesity. It's about perception and why, and understanding how people identify themselves and how they identify what their interests and ideas are. And it allows for other actors to be involved in shaping that thinking. It does have some limitations, although I think it is probably a more useful framework. And a good example of a constructivist approach to global health is the Sustainable Development Goals, where they're basically going, we're going to shape what people see as their ideas and identity, and governments will respond to that and respond to how others respond, and it is continuously evolving. But it doesn't give you a clear kind of predictive framework. If you take a realist framework, you'll go, well, a government is going to act like this because they are acting purely from a self-interest perspective. This kind of goes, well, governments will act based on how they see themselves and how others see them, and this will continually to evolve over time. So it doesn't give you a particularly good predictive theory or model. And it may underestimate the role of power and material incentives in shaping this. So access to oil, access intellectual property in your tax base, if you're in a high-income country, and access to vaccines. So it does have its limitations because it is focused on looking at things on ideas, interests, and identities as your framework. Another framework, perhaps for looking at global health decision-making, and lots has been written on this, and this is definitely not my area of expertise, is perhaps you take a feminist framework. This assumes less emphasis on the state, and it is not your primary category for analysis. It does have some overlaps with a constructivist approach, and gender is one of your key categories. The role of individuals is central to understanding policy making, namely who has and does not have power and how that shapes decision making. The impact of policy making is not equally borne across society, and traditional frameworks for analysis equate rationality with being masculine. You know, therefore a state acting and deciding to go to war is a masculine tendency, and thus tend to dismiss the importance of women and femininity and traditional feminine ideas in understanding how decisions are made. In practice, this will mean you're kind of taking a gender approach to understanding policymaking, thinking about decision making from a gender perspective, looking at who and who is not represented in the policy space, looking at power and agency as drivers of decision making effectiveness, and particularly looking at how power and agency at the individual and perhaps household and family level shapes decision making. And you would critique a global response to a pandemic like Zika that overemphasized women making family planning choices, whilst failing to look at the context in which those choices were made. So this is a kind of, you could take a feminist approach to looking at how a decision was made. And there may be, you know, although I'm obviously showing some of my own political biases here, there may be some limitations to some of the scholarly work in this space, because it does tend to emphasize qualitative and experiential knowledge, perhaps slightly over quantitative ways of looking at things. And it's not a single framework. In fact, if you were to look at feminist theories of international relations, you would get a number of different frameworks, whereas realism and institutionalism tend to be a little more kind of a single framework for understanding things and a bit more overarching. And it is inherently more of a political lens at looking at problems rather than necessarily going, how are decisions made, and then how would you go about approaching problem solving? So it's more kind of analyzing power and politics, but not necessarily looking at a problem solving solutions based approach to things. Or those are some of the arguments that have been made against purely relying on this framework for understanding things. Kind of similar and actually often overlapping, and a lot of people who would consider themselves viewing the world through a post-colonial lens would also consider themselves feminists, is looking at post-colonial framework. And this is, there's already lots of interesting things being written about this in the decolonizing global health space. So it assumes, and this is a map of what the former British Empire was, where you can see that the UK in the late 1800s, unfortunately, had decided that it could rule a large chunk of the world as what it saw itself as a sort of benevolent power, whereas in reality, of course, it was not. So the assumptions of a post-colonial framework are the impacts of colonialism and imperialism are not over. They continue to shape the world today. Western perceptions of the non-West are the result of post-colonial legacy. So how I, as a UK government or UK citizen, view a country in sub-Saharan Africa is shaped by the UK psyche and views around those countries as being dependent and subservient. Or at least that's what this model assumes. The international order is based on hierarchies. So you have the United States and the UK and Western powers, and then you have weaker powers from low and middle income countries or the developing world. And that hierarchy is based on assumptions about who should be able to be responsible and wield power and who is not, and who the other is. And this in practice looks like when you're applying this framework, you challenge assumptions around power and injustice and view the world from the viewpoint of those who lack power. So you're kind of arguing that those who are you're applying a framework that basically looks at, is power being wielded on behalf of the least powerful? There's a focus on race as well as gender, class and culture in analysing global health policy and decision making. So you will look at how does race interact with this? How does class, how does gender, how does culture, whose knowledge and values are being prioritized in the hierarchy of decision making? And like a feminist framework, representation is key. And it also is the understanding of the present is shaped on the legacy of colonialism. Why is it that most global health institutions are still based in the global north, and institutions such as the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, get a disproportionate amount of global health funding resources for research and development? Is that because of the legacy of colonialism? And that would seem to make sense and explain a lot of things. There are some potential limitations of this model because it is heavily related and very centric on the role of the West, and it may perhaps, and the West being kind of Western Europe, North America, and it may not fully explain some modern phenomena, such as the role of China in global health policy making. China was both at one point a subject and controlled by the colonial powers, and is now behaving in some African countries, perhaps in a neo-colonialist way, in terms of encouraging them to accrue large amounts of debt and encouraging them to particularly adopt certain policy decisions. So can a post-colonial framework fully explain that? How does it explain the role of a country like Iran that is actually, playing a humanitarian role in its neighborhood and its actions engaging with certain countries in and around Iran, which again is not a Western power? So it may not fully explain some of the interactions in our modern, more moving away from a unipolar Western power-centric world to a more multipolar world where countries such as China have increasing power, and their behavior can't fully be explained by just looking at a historical colonial model. Finally, moving away from the realms of perhaps a more theory-based approach to analysing problems, you can take a political economy analysis approach. This is a practical problem-solving way of viewing global health decision-making. So PEA is an attempt to find out what's really going on in a situation, what lies behind the surface of an immediate problem, and for example, whether a competing interest exists. There's lots of interesting reading on this, and generally to actually understand how to do political economy analyses well, which is the realm of political and social scientists, then you would look at guides from organizations such as DFID, who have produced a very helpful guide called The Beginner's Guide to Political Economy Analysis, or Everyday Political Analysis is another publication that was commissioned by DFID. And they're a way of going, how do you analyze a policy-making problem? So you will look at 4 big categories. You will look at the structure, what are the background issues that shape the place in which decisions are made, how are decisions really taken, who wields power, and what are the rules of the game. So is it that the military is wielding power, if you were looking at the political economy of global health policy making decision in a country, or is it that one particular individual, when you're thinking about individuals and their role in shaping decisions and bargaining, the stakeholders, who's included and excluded, and what are the underlying driving incentives? And this is where you often would apply a more economic or econometric approach to this. So this is another way of thinking about problems, of kind of going, okay, what is the structure, the background that sets the stage for this particular policy-making environment? How are decisions taken? Which stakeholders are involved? And what are their specific incentives? So this is a very practical approach. So, gone through some frameworks and talked a lot about political science and international relations theory. Now going to go on to looking at how do we apply this in practice. I'm going to hand over to Yassen for this, where we're going to do a group interactive exercise for the last 15 minutes or so.
All right, so just I've typed up here a very quick summary of the WHA 73rd WHA's COVID response resolution, which is now its official name. I think the idea is to look at this and think about what the actors are that are involved in global health, and how we can, using the frameworks described by Mike, we can analyze why certain things are included, why certain things are not included, and who would have pulled in which direction around those decision points. In very brief, this is a very short glance over what's in the resolution. The resolution contains calls for enhanced international collaboration. So it recognizes the fact that COVID is a problem that cannot be solved by a single country. It is one of the most perfect examples of a global health issue, same as climate change. It's the thing that everyone becomes subject to, and that the impacts on the health of a single population is a function of the whole world's managing of that issue. The resolution also calls for continued support of low and middle income and middle income in developing countries, and that is somewhat of how WHO perceives how resources should be allocated, because those countries are the ones that are in most need of assistance for setting up all kinds of systems, including simply healthcare strengthening that is required in the current response. The resolution calls, interestingly, for something that is highly contested, equitable access to essential health products. So that's technologies, diagnostic treatments, and so on. And it calls for, very specifically, the use of TRIPS flexibilities. I won't go into IP law here, but the point is, this is a formal mechanism that exists under the World Trade Organization, rules with respect to accessing or overriding certain patent protections for the sake of public health. The resolution also calls for a response to disinformation and misinformation that surrounds COVID. I think we've all seen this in our national context and in media all around the world. And finally, and interestingly, for the political ramifications of that, the resolution calls for an independent and comprehensive evaluation of the WHO response. As you'll no doubt have seen, critiques from many countries, and not the least, like we mentioned earlier, the US. This resolution was negotiated between April and the beginning of WHA, and the WHO opened with an actual resolution that was already supported by a number of countries and was not edited during the time of the WHO. It was already submitted as a document to be adopted, because it had gathered enough support that it was likely to happen. This being said, on the kind of background of all the discussions during the WHO, which had this single agenda, well, almost a single agenda item, that basically the only content agenda item was COVID. The background of those negotiations were a lot of political tensions between China and the US, if we want to simplify it to the greatest extent possible. Those were the two polarizing, the two poles of the dynamic, and that was seen throughout some of the interactions there. So Mike, I'll let you switch the screen. Oh, yeah, these are the questions that we'll try to address during our chat. So which actors were involved in these negotiations? What were their interests? How much power did they have? And you can try to see which framework you can try to think of which framework you're using when discussing those questions.
Just hold on a second while
And Mike will set us up with a nice online mind mapping tool that we'll all be able to see. So I'll be monitoring the chat, but I encourage you to just raise your hand or unmute in order to be able to interact better. And if no one else is starting this up, I could suggest that as a government that was highly involved in the COVID resolution, I'd put the US and I'd put China. And I think that the framework, you described it a bit in your presentation, but the realist framework is an interesting one to apply to that specific dynamic. I think the tension that we saw at the WHO between those two governments was probably based on something that is way outside of uniquely the COVID response, but it's probably just a struggle for power in the world, as broadly as it can be.
Anyone else got thoughts or particularly thinking through what were the interests driving the US or China's response? What actually was it that was driving and motivating them and their particular role in this? What's that? So was China's engagement with this in terms of China gave 2 billion in aid response? Now that is perhaps not a particularly selfish thing. Why would China be giving that kind of money? What would be the kind of underlying kind of incentives and structures for why China would behave like that? Don't be shy.
Hi, it's Yipeng. So I think a part of that is the ability to build infrastructure in developing nations, and you can look at it from the political economy analysis that you presented, Michael, around other developing nations becoming more reliant on a global superpower, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So you can kind of think through the kind of political economy, and you can think, actually, if you were to do a political economy analysis of this, you need to do it at the global level. A lot of PAs are much more micro level. So yeah, you could take a political economy lens and go look at what those that very practical decision-making approach on how decisions are made. You could also look at the political economy of aid decision-making within China as a very specific political economy analysis, which would be fascinating to look at as to why China makes particular decisions. But yeah, that kind of new emerging superpower, I think, thing is part of it. And China's perhaps maybe a constructivist approach of how China perceives its role in the world and its role on the world stage, shaping their actions as much as the real power dynamics and material power game. Actually, some of it is to do with how China both perceives itself and wants others to perceive it.
Other thoughts, either on this dynamic that we've started working on or on the other actors? You can go ahead and unmute if you have.
So yes, and what do you think would perhaps explain the US and Donald Trump's behavior and what was actually what was the US underlying US interest?
an interesting conversation. I think that we're currently in an election year that shapes all of U.S. Interactions within domestically and internationally, and I think this rejection of existing structures and of multilateralism generally has been a selling point of Trump to his base. I think that can be an explanation. I think we're kind of again in the realist framework where Trump takes a solitary position where he tries to portray the U.S. as being taking an unfair amount of the burden of international organizations, because they are genuinely funding a lot of the international institutions a lot. I think kind of the counterpart of that is that there might not be a realization that with that high level of fund, well, I don't know if there's a realization on Trump's behalf. I think probably is from the technocrats around him that funding also leads to a tremendous amount of global power, and leaving structures leads to erosion of that power. Any other thoughts? Other people on the call? We don't have to make it a US and China thing. Also, there's other countries, you might have followed more closely, and you might be able to explain how they've behaved in this, or the positions they've taken.
So perhaps maybe some interesting countries to look at would be the European Union, and how actually their views on in their statements on the intellectual property bit have slightly evolved from what would be a traditional one. I don't know, Yassen, if you want to.
I mean, it was the intellectual property discussions happened slightly in parallel to the main COVID resolution, because of the initial proposal very early on in the month of February, I believe, from South America, to have a framework of sharing IP and sharing technologies surrounding COVID. So I think that's also, the Costa Rica proposal for patent pools. I think that probably influenced how the rest of the world behaved. In the end, that kind of specific proposal didn't end up within the resolution, but ended up as a separate thing that was announced by WHO the week prior to the WHA, or even the days prior to the WHA.
So there wasn't quite consensus on that one, but it did seem to get a lot of people on board. And interestingly, when patent pools, there's been skepticism towards them, particularly from European countries who have highly valued intellectual property. Do you think anything could perhaps explain why Europe is suddenly going, oh, maybe we should engage with some more innovative approaches to intellectual property than the traditional rigid IP must be preserved at all costs?
I don't know. Does someone have thoughts on that?
Does anyone in particular have any thoughts on the role of other countries in their engagement with this? I hear someone typing.
Maybe just one thought on the European Union that was also hosting that pledging event, kind of collecting money, but outside of WHO for the COVID response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the EU were very much at the centre of sort of fundraising efforts and trying to get a sort of more kind of strong institutions for how things were funded. In some ways, the EU is generally has a fairly traditional institutionalist approach to these kind of things. I think that was, I mean, that was in parallel to that, but it was still about institutions and structures, maybe slightly parallel to WHO, but ultimately it's about government cooperation. And it was both, it wasn't in a traditional institution, but it was still kind of, in some ways, I feel maybe closer to that. Don't know if you have any particular thoughts on how you felt the EU behaved in general in their response, or even how Germany behaved in the WHA.
I mean, Germany, I think, has over the last couple of years been like a really strong partner of WHO, like really raising funds, also flexible funds. And I don't know, have maybe been a bit surprising now with their perspective on patents compared to the transparency resolution last year.
Yeah, and I do wonder whether some of those views on patents is suddenly governments going, wait a second, we may not be the first one to, because normally the views on patents is, I guess, or intellectual property, it's somewhere in between a liberal institutionalist and a realist approach to global goods, because it's essentially my companies will get the patent and I will therefore be able to make money. It's not necessarily about access to the medication per se, but it's about an economic model. When you're suddenly going, oh crap, we're dependent on other countries, suddenly your frame of reference perhaps changes, because your idea is like, oh, actually, and also your experience. Germany had previously seen itself as quite a strong global player that had a strong healthcare system, but has been affected by COVID, and its economy has been affected by it. So that's, I think, shaped, perhaps you can think about how COVID has shaped Germany's, both outside world's perception of Germany, and also how it has shaped Germany's perception of itself. And Germany is wanting to hedge its bets, because it does now see that it is as vulnerable as other countries, and that actually one country holding all the intellectual property rights, that's great for that country, but if you're not that country and you may be beaten to the vaccine, then you're a bit stuffed. And it's creating incentives for this kind of global cooperation in a way that is perhaps less self-interested, and partly because of a change in how governments perceive themselves and their own vulnerability. Yes.
Any other thoughts? No, I unmuted myself to try to get other people to suggest thoughts. Otherwise, has anyone thought about, if we go in a different section, for instance, how the Gates Foundation has responded to this, for example? Or we could do civil society if someone has more thoughts.
So what has the Gates Foundation's response to this? How have the Gates Foundation responded to COVID? I guess is, I mean, a lot of people will probably have read, and I know that about a gazillion conspiracy theories now that Bill Gates is responsible for everything. And I'm sure he wishes that he had that much power. But how have they responded to it?
I mean, I can go ahead. They've pledged a lot of money. They've pledged a lot of their, basically, a lot of the resources that they provide to global health have been directed towards the COVID response, in short. And I think that some of the conspiracy theories could be looked at from those different frameworks as well. It could be interesting. I guess most conspiracy theories are probably based in a sort of realist framework of trying to ascribe some sort of solitary and self-interested nature to those philanthropic foundations, which I think it's always important to keep at the back of our minds that those are private entities and they might have interests that are different from the general population. But I think it's also it might be one step too far to say that that Bill Gates created COVID in order to have his foundation give money to COVID research.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is you could actually apply some of the sort of more critical frameworks. You could also look at what is the role of Gates in this if you were applying maybe a feminist framework or a post-colonial framework. Why is it that Bill Gates has so much power and influence versus actually, you know, why has he amassed so much ability to influence and shape the response? And you can take, and there has been a lot of critical stuff written pre-COVID about the role of the Gates Foundation in distorting the global health landscape and in global health policy making, and that a lot of that critical stuff has come from those kind of angles around justice and allocation of resources and who has power and who wields power on behalf of whom. And so you can apply that to Bill Gates' decision making. Why is it that Bill Gates gets to decide this pot of money is purely allocated towards COVID, as opposed to necessarily these resources to the secondary effects of COVID? Should it be that actually that Bill Gates' money should actually not be going to COVID and that we shouldn't be dependent on them? We should be taxing big corporations. I'm revealing some of my own political biases here. But what should their role be in these responses, and where does power sit, and who should wield power? And I think that's an important thing to think about, even if there may not be a right answer to that, but it's at least something to be aware of. And I know that some people within the Gates Foundation are quite good at thinking critically about their power and their distorting effect on the global health landscape.
I mean, the interesting thing about the Gates Foundation is really not the money that they pledge, but the redirection of funding. And to be fair, like the Gates Foundation has for a long time kind of closed holes that has been there in global health funding, and that no one else wanted to fill that, like governments did not give the money for. But now we kind of came to the point where we see that if it's private money, they can actually decide privately about what they do with it. And now they decided to spend it still in global health, just now all in COVID, which obviously then creates problems for a lot of other programs, like thinking about the vaccination programs that he has heavily been funding before and all those kind of things. I don't know, I have a lot of opinions on allocation of money and how people, I think it's just, if it is his private money, he obviously can decide himself. The question is, should those holes be there, or how can they fill otherwise if there is this big foundation involved?
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And I think, yeah, the point you raised is definitely right. That is his private money at the end of the day. He, you know, and there are lots of other philanthropies that have a much smaller, that fund global health, that are much smaller than the Gates Foundation. So, but they don't have the same effect in shaping it. And I think the point you alluded to there is who is, I guess, and it's the question that a lot of activists and civil society, particularly those who take a critical approach to things, go, is who is Bill Gates actually ultimately accountable to for decision making and policy making? Who ultimately, if Bill Gates funds something that actively causes harm, who is he accountable to? Is he accountable to someone? Not saying that he will, and that I mean, I do believe that he is making decisions based on what he believes is in the best interest of beneficiaries of the Gates Foundation, and is acting in their best, what he believes is their best interest. But there is questions about how is he accountable, and he's not accountable in the same way that a government is, to spend money well and spend money fairly and equitably. Yassen, do you have any?
No, I was just wondering, and now we're running over. Do we want to continue the chat? Do people have, those who haven't spoken, do you have comments? Would you like to open on a different section of our analysis?
or do you have questions about what Yassen and I said earlier? Because I think we will wrap up in the next few minutes if people are not particularly feeling like this. This was us piloting, trying to do an interactive session, and in real life, both of us will pick on people normally. So it's a bit unfair to do it on a webinar with your webcams off. But is there any particular questions about anything that we covered that people want answering? Or final comments?
Yeah, maybe can we have like a short, just like a really short introduction into the role of civil society in the COVID resolution, or something that is basically discussed virtually and beforehand, and where is the space for civil society in that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I'm sure, Yassen, you've got lots of thoughts on that. I know I do, but does anyone else, before we jump in and kind of dominate that, or Laura, if you have anything in particular that you wanted to say, and your thoughts on the role of civil society?
I don't know. I think it's more difficult, but there is surely also opportunities. I mean, Costa Rica maybe not coming up all by itself with a proposal on a patent pool, but a lot of access to medicines, also civil society organizations being involved in that. But as a whole, I think it's for many more difficult, especially for the ones that might be less established and having less direct contact.
Yeah, and I think there is actually, a lot of the traditional, I mean, this is a broader thing, traditional avenues for civil society pressure have disappeared, particularly given that many civil society organizations do, particularly in the global south, do rely on physical as well as digital organizing. We talked about who has access and people being accountable, and actually their kind of accountability is a bit different when it's all digital pressure and not any physical pressure on governments. With demonstrations and things, and your ability to organize is both, I mean, enhanced by digital tools, but you don't have any of the traditional methods of influence available to you, and there's no opportunity for those chance influencing things. As Yassen alluded to, decisions are made often quite informally or influenced informally over coffee. If you happen to be sitting next to someone in the Geneva cafe, and one of the cafes that happens to be a diplomat for a key member state, and incidentally strike up conversation with them, that can shape things in a way that those informal opportunities for influence for civil society have vanished. And it does, I think you're right, privilege so existing well-structured civil society organizations, particularly those who are digitally literate, and does perhaps not benefit civil society organizations that are perhaps newer and not as well established.
Yeah, I mean, you summarized pretty much everything that I've said. I think that there are opportunities that are sometimes not even accidental. So being close to a decision maker in an informal space can be a strategic decision that a civil society advocate or member, regardless of how you want to call them, does. So you can try to place yourself close to, for instance, the closed meeting room, and then try to bump into someone who is coming out of there to try to chat with them, either get information or provide information. All of that is kind of how influence in those spaces is structured. I think moving everything digitally with spaces where there are only invitation to selected people from governments restricts the capacity to do so a lot or almost completely. There are certainly older civil society organizations that have established contacts within the governments with which they work that will still be able to leverage those spheres of influence that they already have. But definitely, it would be harder to try to approach stakeholders that you don't have a prior relationship with. And I think that is kind of an erosion of the powers that civil society has currently.
Okay, unless anyone has any last minute questions, because I noticed we're losing a few people as well, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you, and thank you for bearing with us. I know we were trying to do something interactive, and I'm glad that you're stuck with us on your Sunday.
Maybe I can
talk about these things, and really appreciate it. We will send out a feedback form as well, asking for your advice, and the slides from all the presentations will be shared. Yes, and I'll hand over to you for any other final remarks you want to make.
Oh, I was going to say the traditional selfie remark, maybe as a kind of like we did yesterday. If everyone wants to turn on their cameras, we can try to take a virtual group selfie and then close the session. Thanks for everyone who stuck all the way to the end, and for everyone who chose to attend. We'll give everyone we'll give everyone time to reposition. Okay, there's 4 people that have no video, but I'll assume that they do not want to take part in this. Oh no, someone else is coming. Let's give them a second. Hi, Yupeng. All right, I think that will be it. Ready, set, go. Okay, I took a few.
Great to see you all, and thank you for joining, and we will share everything, and hopefully see you all in person sometime soon.
Have a good end of the weekend. Bye, everyone.
Bye.